A new documentary is starting.
I just say, God.
Is starting in Australian cinemas from the 10th of March. Documentary called Wash My Soul in the River's Flow. Love the title. And it's my pleasure to be speaking to the writer, producer, director of this documentary, Philippa Bateman. Philippa, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here.
I'm sure you are, with, as you were saying, with the floods in Sydney and so on. So, and you're in Tassie. So tell me about putting this documentary together, because it is such an intriguing mix, obviously, of Archie Roach and Ruby Hunter and their songs, a 2004 concert, never before seen black and white archival footage of the two of them, and some beautiful images of the Murray River, etc. What a fascinating concept. How did it all come about?
Well, there were two parts. The first is that in 2004, when Archie and Ruby were collaborating with Paul Grabowski in the Australian Art Orchestra to create the concert Curatunga, I was approached by the concert director, Patrick Nolan, to basically document the process. And he's currently with Opera Queensland as an artistic director, and is a very good theatre and opera director. And he said to me, look, I don't know what it is, but I think there's something very special about this show. I think it's going to be special. And I said, great, let's do it. At the time, I was financing a film, Jindabyne, by Ray Lawrence, and there was a lot going on, but I thought, this is a sort of a once in a lifetime opportunity to capture Archie and Ruby doing something special. Let's do it. So that was the first part, and that was where we filmed the rehearsals, the conversations with Patrick that you see in the film. That was in a St Kilda hotel where they spent a day with Archie and Ruby, talking to Patrick really about the background behind the songs and what the songs meant to them, because Patrick and Archie and Ruby hadn't worked together before, but Paul Grabowski had worked with Archie before and with Ruby. And then we filmed the opening night, which is the concert, which is the premiere, which was at Melbourne International Arts Festival. And then it all went into a box and didn't come out again until 2020, January 2020. The reason that the film didn't get made, I could spend an hour on it, it would be very boring. And it's really what happens with a lot of films, which is kind of heartbreaking. It's just things happen and the film doesn't happen. But I always sort of held a light for the possibility that it might. And despite moving a lot and having a lot going on in my life, I kept all the footage and the DAT tapes in a relatively small plastic box that I dragged around with me and kept in my closet. I cared about my clothes a lot, so I knew it would be safe with my clothes. And then I sort of pulled it out and thought, look, Patrick and I had spoken a few times about the importance of making it. Ruby passed in 2010, and that was quite traumatic because we realized that we'd make the film and Ruby wouldn't be here to see it, which was not great. And of course, I approached Archie. He was working with Paul Grabowski again, doing a concert at the Sydney Festival. I was invited backstage and I spoke to them both, and then asked Archie's permission and for him to come on as a producer, and he did. And I reached out to Ruby Hunter's family and her brothers in South Australia. And then I I had to get funding because the footage I couldn't actually view. So I didn't know what I had, which was bizarre. It's like I couldn't view the rushes because that technology, DV and digital Betacam, didn't exist anymore. So I had to get funding to see what I had, which I did, and I had no money really when I started. So the upside to that was, as a director, you often, you have an editor and you have a producer and you have some assistants helping you get everything together. I had nobody. But the advantage was that I had to log the rushes. So I logged it prior to an editor coming on, which meant that I was very familiar with every frame in the film, not the film, the footage. I knew what the challenges were, and I knew every note and every song back to front. And what I saw in that was that what was missing was country. And, you know, we can talk about that. But when I looked at the footage, I thought, actually, this is a love story first and foremost. And it's a love story about Archie and Ruby's love story. It's a love story about their relationship to music and to country. So it was finding a way of combining those three main elements in a way that was respectful in terms of that it was from their point of view, but they weren't making the film. But I tried very hard to observe the way they worked and to reflect that in how I put the film together.
Well, congratulations on that, because the film flows, if you pardon the semi-pun in there.
No, that was exactly the editorial principle. Exactly. Flow. Yeah.
Yeah. Hence the title as well, which is one of the songs, which is great. And I agree with you that that footage of country, as you say, of the Murray River and of various other bits of country are so beautiful, and they sit so nicely amongst the concert footage and the discussions between Ruby and Archie, etc., and Patrick, as you mentioned. So, as you said, then the editing process, the flow of the film is so beautiful in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, I think it took. We did the music first, so we did the songs first, and the interviews. So we had the rehearsal, the concert, and the interviews. Well, they weren't interviews; they were a conversation. But the strange thing was that was all together, and I was using stock footage. But then when I went to South Australia with Bonnie Elliott, who's the superb cinematographer who did the landscape and the Super 8 and what I call the cloud tank. So Bonnie and I put ink and paint into the water, which is the backgrounds to the text and the intertitles. It was interesting because when I went to South Australia and I actually saw, we were using drones for the aerial kind of shots. And I'd said to Bonnie, excuse me, I wanted quite a painterly approach, and I wanted to have a multi kind of layered textural approach visually. So that's why the interviews are in black and white. And there's a sort of slightly grainier, DV, because we use software to improve that image, and also with the sound, because the concert had been very disappointingly recorded in mono. And so we had Sam Petty, who is a genius sound designer, work absolute miracles with the sound. And so when I went to Narundjeri country, I was so thrilled because I'd said to Bonnie, I don't want any mid shots. We need very close and very grand, extremely wide shots. And part of that was about creating a rhythm between the intimacy of the love story, but on this grand landscape, which is country, and also the grand landscape of history and memory. And I wanted it to be beautiful because it is beautiful, and Archie and Ruby are beautiful, but it was somehow just finding a way. And also the pace of the shots, like they were very, I wanted a slow rhythm of the shots that I could make work with, the flow. And I didn't want the landscape to be like inserts, which is, where you sort of cut to a bit of landscape. I wanted it to be very integrated and feel that the music and the narrative and the country just, that they all flowed into each other, and that there was a balance. Like the landscape is almost as much a star in the film as Archie and Ruby are.
Absolutely, yeah, no, it looks great. And it's good to see a musical, in a sense, film with 8 songs and an Indigenous focus. I mean, I can't think of too many documentaries that have actually done that.
No, well, interestingly, it is a documentary, but I didn't see it as a documentary. I didn't conceive it as a documentary. I thought of it as, and there's concert films. Just excuse me. there's concert films, and people originally, I think, you know, when we were talking about finance, they're like, oh, it's a concert film, and I was like, well, no, not exactly. It's you know, it's a biography, it's a love story, it's a concert film. You know, it's an ode to country. It's, you know, and people are like, so it's a concert film then. And it's interesting about that whole discussion, because quite often what we came up against was, say, broadcasters or, you know, distributors saying, well, you know, music films are very niche. And I was sitting there thinking, well, I'm a producer too, and I know that 20 of the top box office documentaries of all time, 50% of them are music films. So they're not that niche. And also, I kind of, look, I can understand, because people hadn't seen my work as a director, and it's very difficult. It was a very difficult film to kind of pitch and sell the way that I saw it. And then, of course, when people see it, they go, oh, yes. Oh, now I see what you mean, which is totally understandable and fine. But the First Nations focus was just purely because it really is Archie and Ruby's story. And what I thought that my job was as a director was to serve them. And I also didn't want, I wanted it to be beautiful, and I use the word glamorous in the best possible way. I wanted, because I think they are glamorous and beautiful and amazing artists, that I wanted people to relate to that First Nations story through that. It's a stolen generation story, but the stolen generation story is something that I wanted the audience to discover. I didn't want it to be pushed out front. I didn't want it to be preachy. I didn't want it to be didactic, because people turn off. And I'm like that, not just about, you know, I'm like that with anything that tells me how to think or what to do. I'm like, oh, I'm bored. I'm not doing, you know, chick. So the First Nations, I mean, focus is really as a result of it being about Archie and Ruby and their stories. And that's what the film is about.
Yes. And yes, as you say, the stolen generations sort of issue comes out very subtly and very, very well in terms of the songs and the way it's presented. It's not didactic, as you say. So yes, I was very impressed by that. And I must say the film should be seen in cinemas, because apart from the look of the film, which is fantastic, the sound design, or the sound that you've already alluded to, is so good, and it needs to be in a cinema to get the full quality of the sound.
I'm so glad you said that, because, you know, I did something just ridiculously and possibly stupid in the era of COVID, was to make an old-fashioned film to be seen in cinemas when people aren't going to the cinema very much. But it's interesting, because obviously I've seen it on a small screen, I've seen it on a television screen, and I've seen it on the, you know, I've seen it in many cinemas now. And it's interesting, my producing partner, Kate Hodges, who is wonderful and did amazing work on the film. You know, she hadn't, when we were getting towards the end of the edit, she wasn't, you know, in the edit room very much. And we had a screening room where we worked. So whenever she saw it and I showed her cuts, it was in a kind of mini cinema. So she always saw it in that context. And then when we were doing post-production, she was kind of looking at me almost panicked when she saw it on the sort of small screen. She was like, it's not the same film. I was like, well, no, of course it's not the same film. I mean, because it is very immersive. Like, there are films that you can absolutely see that, you know, they're talking heads, they're sort of shot in a way that, you know, they don't suffer terribly by being seen on a television screen. You know, it's like you can kind of cope with it. But this was very much the music and the look of the film, but also the emotional way that you relate to the story has a lot to do. It's a slow pace. It's not fast. It has to kind of wash over you. You need to sort of be immersed in it. And what a lot of people who have seen it in a cinema say, you know, it starts and they're surprised that it's not sort of a gritty documentary in that sort of style, and then they say they forget they're watching a documentary, that it's something else. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that they're in a cinema and that they can, you know, it's yeah, I mean, look, I grew up in the dark. I'm a cinema baby, and you know, that's what I love. I don't like to have my cinema viewing interrupted by telephone calls and needing to make a cup of coffee. I even get very cranky when people go to the toilet at the cinema. So, you know, it's like I'm probably a bit of a purist in that regard.
Fair enough. I'll endorse that. And I agree with you about that immersive quality, especially as the songs develop throughout the film. It's yeah, it has a real charm. So the film is releasing March 10th. And I'm wondering too if the film has international currency as well.
Look, I hope it does, to be honest, because it was pretty hard. I mean, it was pretty nerve-wracking getting the funding in on time to finish the film. We deferred all of our fees and we were very distracted. Also, COVID, we were supposed to release at the Melbourne International Film Festival. Then, you know, Sydney got put off. Anyway, without going into the COVID drama that is every filmmaker's drama during the era of COVID,
yep.
It really messed up our whole access to the festivals and things. So I think what we're concentrating on right now is this release. But if the film does well in cinemas and it works for people, then I think it will have a life internationally. And that's the sort of the next step. But, you know, I mean, look, the other thing I have to say, I think it's very difficult for Australian filmmakers because there used to be, a long time ago, I worked at the Australian Film Commission as a production executive, and there was a lot more money around in those days. But there was enormous support for films. There was a whole marketing department that was dedicated to festivals and staying in contact with festivals and what was Screen Australia then. You know, they brought out Pierre Rission from Cannes. I mean, I sat in rooms with Pierre Rission going through films. I learned a lot. And there was a lot of support for filmmakers at festivals. That doesn't happen anymore. So it's pretty hard because everyone's very focused on television and TikTok. And so, and interestingly, because I was in America, you know, when I had the fellowship, I worked with Art Skibney's company and I was there 2019, and you know, Netflix and all those companies, they still use cinemas to put films out because they understand the value of that. So look, I speak for everyone where I say it would be great to get more support for festivals, but there's not a lot.
I understand. Yes, I'm getting that same message from so many filmmakers who I speak to. Okay, it's interesting you mentioned Jindabyne that you were involved with, and also The Boys, and I read The Beehive, and you also were thanked for Final Quarter and Walking on Water, for example. So you have some very attachments, so to speak, with various films.
Yeah, well, look, I've spent most of my professional career as a production executive and a producer. So when I was thanked on Walking on Water and Two Hands, I also was I was a development executive on that. And The Boys, I was a production executive on, and was I suppose The Boys is the one I feel very proud of because I had a lot to do with my colleagues at the Australian Film Commission, getting that film funded. You know, at that time, there was a lot of opposition because of the subject matter and the Anita Cobby murder, which it's not about, but everyone thought it was. I mean, it is related to that, obviously. And yes, Jindabyne was a film that I was the executive producer on, but was produced, we financed that film with my former production company, April Films. And I also worked with United Artists. I had a first look deal with Universal and United Artists. And The Final Quarter, Ian Darling, who is a filmmaker and a philanthropist, but a filmmaker foremost, he made the Final Quarter, and I actually have an office at his production company as well. And he was responsible wholly for getting this film to the point where it got financed, as in Wash My Soul and the Rivers Flow. He made a very significant philanthropic donation for production. He helped me in development. He gave me a desk. He was amazing. So he's a very generous peer and friend, and did amazing things. And I executive produced a film of his, Alone Across Australia, in 2004, actually same year that we filmed this. And so we have a 20-year professional relationship.
How interesting. The networking and connections and so on in the industry are so
I know.
So
well, look, sorry, go on.
No, you go on. What were you going to say?
No, I was just going to say, I worked for a very long time making other people's films happen, and I loved it. But at a particular point in time, I thought it's time for me to start making my own films. And the other thing is that when I did the Beehive, I work a lot with visual artists who do screen-based media art. So I produced a work for Vivid, which is the light exhibition by an artist, Brad Miller, called Starry Night. And then I made the Beehive with director Zanny Begg, which was screened at Acme for 3 months, which was an art installation and a non-linear documentary. So I moved away from very conventional, what I would call feature films, because for me, because I work with American studios and things, and the independent versions of American studios, I saw that the funding and the whole industry was changing in 2009, when the financial collapse happened in America, and the technology and the funding changed. And I really spent several years just not working in feature film because I didn't want to. And I was in Paris, and I was writing and taking photographs and working with visual artists and documentary. So the last 10 years, has been a much more personally creatively satisfying time, but I really haven't been part of the industry for a decade. Yeah.
How interesting. So are you working on a new project at the moment?
I am. I've got a few. I have got a fiction film, but it's not what people would expect. And there's another documentary, but more in the style of this kind of film, that's also music related. So I've got a few projects.
Terrific. And I must ask you, I ask this of all filmmakers to conclude, have you seen any films recently, or are there any filmmakers that inspire you that you want to comment on?
Look, I was very thrilled to be able to sit in a cinema 7-8 hours a day at the Sydney Film Festival. And I got to see some amazing films there. Drive My Car, I loved.
Yeah.
What was it? Looney
Yes,
banging porn film. I
Yep.
thought that was great.
Yep.
I really loved, Almodovar is one of my top 5 directors of all time, and Parallel Mothers I just thought was exquisite. That's more of a conventional like, I know, but Drive My Car is a superb film. I think that was probably my favorite of the festival. But I saw lots of great films there, and there's lots of great filmmakers making films. That's the exciting thing. Like, people are like, oh, cinema is dead. And if you're in Australia, you might think that's the case, because I don't think Australian filmmakers are being supported to make, Power of the Dog, Jane Campion's film, one of my top 3 this year, without a doubt. I thought I hate to say this, but because it's just such a cliche, but it's true. It's a masterwork. I felt like I was watching a John Ford film, but better. It was just like The Searchers, but it was modern, it was contemporary, but it worked within a genre of kind of cowboy films and westerns that was just, it was so cleverly written. It was so, I was just blown away by that film. I loved it. So yeah, Parallel Mothers, Drive My Car, and Power of the Dog, I think, are my top 3.
I fully endorse all of those films there,
Okay.
and your comments. They are terrific films, and
Yeah.
I also want to endorse Wash My Soul in the River's Flow, screening in cinemas from March the 10th. And it's been my great pleasure to speak to the writer, producer, director of the film, Philippa Bateman. Philippa, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure.
All the best in Tassie.
Thank you. I'm loving it. Love Tassie.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.